Welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Justin Clark,
And I'm Mattimore Cronin.
and today we're discussing the future of 5G. And we'll get into the security concerns, the health concerns, but also the business implications. First, though, Mattimore, what is 5G?
Yeah, so 5G is the fifth generation of the internet.
Mhm.
And so about every 10 years, they'll update the internet infrastructure to keep pace with the changing technology and devices. So we started with 2G, then 3G, then 4G. Now 5G is the next generation. And
Mhm.
really, it's a software defined network. So there's still cables, it's not entirely cloud based, but this is the big step in the direction of having everything be processed in the cloud.
Mhm.
And the capabilities from having these denser bandwidth networks are pretty extraordinary. So there's 100 times greater capacity with 5G than with 4G.
Mhm. And
So
that basically means that right now, 4G, for example, can put out, let's say, 200 megabits per second, or like that's the bandwidth of things that you can download. So if you're streaming a movie from a mobile device, that's the fastest you can download. With
yeah,
5G, you can download at 20 gigabits per second,
yeah, so to put
which
that
is
in
crazy.
terms that are more real world, so let's say you want to download a 2 hour movie before a
Mhm.
flight. With 3G, it would take you 26 hours to download that movie. With
Mhm.
4G, it takes about 6 minutes. With 5G, it would only take 3.6 seconds to download that movie. So this is a huge game changer. I mean, one of my friends made the comment that this might kill cable companies because people right now, a lot of people watch cable, like they'll watch the live news or a live sporting event as
Mhm.
opposed to streaming it on their phone, like streaming it through Twitter or something, because it's just a much better connection and you don't have to deal with internet lags. But
Mhm.
once the connection speed with 5G is instantaneous, there is very little reason to use cable or to pay for a cable package. So I thought
Yeah.
that was an interesting development.
Yeah. That is really interesting because one thing to differentiate to just for listeners is 4G, 5G, these are mobile networks. So
Hmm.
there are also other networks like Wi-Fi. That's not a mobile network. You can
Right.
still use a mobile device, but it basically assumes, so Wi-Fi assumes that you'll be in roughly the same spot. So it doesn't have to like, you don't have to
Hmm.
switch towers. Like your device isn't trying to listen for a connection from different towers all over the place. It just listens to a single router in your home. But
Right.
with 5G, you can be on the move anywhere streaming these really high bandwidth media content.
Hmm.
So yeah, just to differentiate between like the mobile network and then there's like a local area network. We don't need to get into all of that stuff, but there's just a
Yeah.
difference to
And
to think about.
another unique aspect of 5G is that even though it has a much better signal, it has a
Hmm.
much shorter range. So
Hmm.
whereas 2G and 3G and 4G have a pretty wide range, like you can be pretty far away from a cell tower and still get decent service. With 5G, that's not the case. So the density with which to build 5G is going to be much greater. So for instance, right now, there's only a cell tower about every 30 to 40 houses per
Hmm.
square kilometer. With 5G, we're going to need literally hundreds of cell towers per square kilometer.
Yeah, and one of the reasons for that is um, the frequency of the waves that are being transmitted over the air,
Much higher
they are
frequency.
they're a lot shorter, which
Yeah.
means they can't penetrate through solid barriers as easily, or
Mm.
they just can't in general. If it comes up against a solid concrete wall, you're not going to get any sort of signal from a 5G frequency. So they have to make a whole bunch of them to compensate for the fact that there is, this downside to having barriers all over the place, and they just need to make sure that the signal gets to where it needs to go. by
Right.
building a whole bunch of towers.
Yeah. And I think for some people, we might say, like, why build 5G? Like, isn't the internet already pretty good? It seems like we're going to need to do a lot of overhaul for our infrastructure, and there's national security concerns, there are health concerns. We're going to get into all of those. But one thing that I noticed through my research is that the limits of 4G are already being pushed in urban areas. So in places like, LA, New York, the big cities that really are pushing the limits. So in those places, it makes total sense to implement 5G because otherwise people aren't going to buy as many connected devices,
Hmm.
and it's sort of become a bottleneck in the Internet of Things,
Yeah,
development. And that's why what we're going to see 5G roll out is in the dense urban areas first.
yeah,
And because it takes such a big investment to put all of these cell towers in place, we may not see it in rural areas for quite some time.
yeah.
The numbers that I was looking at is that we're supposed to have only 50% of the US is going to be covered by 5G by the year 2025.
Hmm.
And,
But that'll
that's
mostly be in cities, so
right.
still like a big chunk of the population just, you
Yeah,
know.
but by 2020, the big cities will already be covered. It's just that
Mhm,
it'll be such a slow rollout to get to the more rural areas, especially in
mhm.
as dispersed of a country as the US.
Right.
Um, and just some other interesting things around the business side is that it's much more difficult in Europe to implement 5G
Hmm.
because there's so many different countries and different rules and different
Yeah.
um, different regulations. So, whereas Europe is about the same size as the U.S., there's
Mhm.
60 different sets of rules and regulations you have to go through to get something
Really?
like this implemented. Whereas in the
So
U,
even the EU regulations, every country that belongs to the EU, that wouldn't be like one set of regulations. Is it like by
exactly.
country? Oh wow.
Yeah, because all of these countries have their own security concerns and they all have their own relations with other countries and
Hmm.
they all have their own, sectors of the workforce to worry about and lobbyists. So I
Yeah.
think another, we can talk about the internet inequality. That might be a good topic to hit next. But it does seem like Europe may fall behind with 5G. And
Yeah.
in a similar way, the US may fall behind China because when you look about the ability to upgrade the internet for your country, China has complete control over their whole private sector and public sector.
Hmm.
US has at least it's all within the same country, so it's easier than the EU.
Right.
And then, developing countries will pretty much just do whatever whoever gives them the best deal.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm worried about. One thing though, what you said about why people are motivated to move from 4G to 5G is so if you've ever been to like a college football game or any sort of big sporting event and you're in the stadium with everyone else and you try to use your phone, it doesn't work
Oh yeah,
because
yeah.
there's so many people trying to access the same network that it just doesn't have the bandwidth. But with 5G, that's not going to be a problem anymore. So there's definitely areas, like you said, whether it's urban areas or big stadiums where there's a huge
Hmm.
concentration of people trying to use their mobile device.
Or
Like,
like a big event like, South by
yeah,
Southwest or
yeah,
Coachella, and
yeah.
that's the other thing that's unique about 5G is that it allows for what they call network slicing. So this
Hmm.
means that you can basically pay extra to get extra bandwidth if you need it. So if you have some big event like South by Southwest, you can pay the telecom providers and have high bandwidth for these days in this
Hmm.
location. And that also is likely to contribute to what is referred to as the internet inequality. And
Okay.
I think it'd be
So you
good to
just pay for better access, basically.
right.
Is that?
So with 5G, you will be able to pay for better access, which also
Mm,
means if you can't pay, you're going to have worse access. And like we already said, in a lot of these rural areas, uh, they don't even have immediate plans to implement 5G.
mhm.
So as a futurist, when you look at how this will play out over the coming years and decades, there's a serious advantage to people who have high connectivity and to cities that have high connectivity. And when you
Hmm.
think about all of the time that you waste, all of those seconds waiting for a page to load or a video to stream or a communication to go through, all of those seconds add up, and that is, billions of dollars in lost efficiency.
Yeah. And one way to take that even further is if we're talking about big cities, the the Internet of Things and all of these sensors all over the place, whether that's
Yeah.
smart cars or let's say sensors in the water system or the electrical grid, and embedding, let's say, some sort of predictive analytics or AI
Hmm.
to, determine when should electricity be sent to this part of the country and when should water be diverted, or what, all of these things that can be automated, they need to be connected to the internet.
Yeah.
And if we have if we have better capacity, let's say with 5G, then we can add these sensors all over the place and they can always be connected to each other. And we can have these, we there's talk of smart cities, but I don't think we truly, I don't even know if I truly comprehend what a smart city can be
Hmm.
if there are sensors all over the
Right.
place in their infrastructure.
Well, I guess the way I look at it, so I saw this video yesterday that was a time lapse of a plant throughout the day.
Uh,
And it shows that plants don't just sit still. They actually move
yeah,
around a lot throughout the day. And when you
yeah,
see a time lapse, it like has a personality. It gets really happy when there's lots of sunshine, and then it'll
yeah, or
slow
water.
down and gets a little depressed when it's dark or when it hasn't had water. And it
Uh,
made me realize that from the plant's perspective, humans are moving super fast.
uh,
And basically, what the internet allows us to do, and what faster internet like 5G allows us to do, is to move at an even faster pace. So we're
mhm,
basically like hacking time by having 5G, having these faster
yeah,
speeds. And if you play that out, I mean, it's basically like a civilization that is moving at a higher speed than another civilization. That's the
mhm.
advantage of 5G. And the longer this plays out, the bigger the implications are going to be.
Yeah, so I heard an interesting lecture by Terence McKenna
Yeah.
yesterday. He's the, psychonaut. I think I forgot when he died, but anyways, he's, this legendary psychonaut that was talking about time and how time is increasing speed. It like the way he was defining time is the number of events per,
Hmm.
unit of, let's say, a year or something. If you look back 4 billion years, barely anything was happening. And as you go more towards the present, there are more events happening because we're more connected and because things are more connected. So the more events that take place, the more innovation that takes place. And then the faster, let's say, AI can iterate on itself or
Yeah.
learn and all of this stuff.
Well,
So the internet. Oh, go
let's
ahead.
get into those capabilities because one thing that struck me in this research is that there are a lot of new products, services, and businesses that will be unlocked by 5G that weren't previously available. So you already mentioned the Internet of Things, right?
Hmm.
That's huge. I mean, connected
Yeah,
everything.
yeah,
Another area is VR and AR because
yeah.
right now,
Especially AR,
yeah,
because then you're mobile and on the move, and you're not
totally.
going to be just sitting at your home under, Wi-Fi is pretty good, but if you can be mobile with
Right.
augmented
Well,
reality.
because right now, what is VR? It's like you have this clunky headset that has a
Hmm.
fat wire that's
Yeah,
connected to a supercomputer, and that's a huge limitation. If you
yeah,
have 5G, if you can download a 2-hour movie in 3 seconds, with that capability, you could have something that looks as sleek as Warby Parker glasses
yeah.
and some like AirPod looking, hermetically sealed hearables, and you can
Hmm.
basically walk around the world and have full VR or AR capabilities. And this could be the first step in the direction of a brain machine interface because
Yeah,
5G is the first network that will be almost at the speed of thought.
yeah. I mean, and you could even have a sort of a rudimentary brain machine interface where you're not, looking into the depths of the brain and you're only looking at what makes it to the conscious part of the brain, which actually is, I think it's really hard to define, so I'm not going to claim to know exactly what it is, but suppose the cortex, like the conscious part of the brain, is not really processing that many, let's say, bits of information, which is the same units that computers use for information. So
Hmm.
I mean, I think 5G can handle a relatively simple brain machine interface if, if we're not tapping into the unconscious components of the mind and thought and all of that good
Yeah.
stuff.
I mean, there could be something where, based on where you're looking at the screen, you can search for various things, or based on
Yeah.
hand gestures, or obviously voice is something that'll be big.
Hmm.
The question will be when they can connect it to thought, because that'll be a huge
Yeah. That's when we
efficiency
have the
improvement.
neural
But
link
exactly, but
that,
it also
that
gets a little spooky. But yeah, I mean,
yeah.
with 5G, a response time, so the time from when you tap something on a screen to when it actually goes to that next screen, only 1 millisecond in latency with 5G, which is 400 times faster than the blink of an eye. So
Yeah.
that's pretty instantaneous. I mean,
Yeah. We're not
4G
even going
is
to notice that.
4.5 times slower than that. So it's awesome. And then, some other businesses, so autonomous vehicles, they're already around, but with
Yeah.
5G you can connect them all to each other and truly have an
Yeah.
interconnected
Like
transportation
system of
system.
cars. Yeah.
Yeah, and some people who have made arguments for, like, maybe the cons outweigh the pros for 5G. They've
Yeah.
said,
We do
like,
need to talk about the cons.
right, and we're going to talk about them, but first for the pros,
I know.
like, people have said, if you're in a self-driving car or if you're having robotic remote surgery, you do not want any lag time. It is crucial that there is no lag time. So
Hmm.
for some applications, it is truly a game changer.
Yeah. And especially too, because so with some devices, there are, there are ways that you can just do a lot of processing on the device itself. But there are a lot of applications, especially cars and systems of,
Hmm.
the whole
Anything
traffic
with
system.
machine learning, pretty much.
I'll touch on that too. But with a system of cars, you have to communicate with all of the other cars on the network. It's not just you're not the only thing. That's not the only car that's on the road. So you need to know where all the other cars are, and that requires an internet connection. Whereas some things you can basically program the computer to do without connecting to the internet because it just does this straightforward task, let's say like a warehouse robot of some
Hmm.
sort. Um, but on the machine learning front, there's definitely times when machine learning requires connection to the internet, and let's say it's like streaming data to learn, like the learning
Right, right.
process. But for the most part, when you're applying the machine learning, then it doesn't actually need to be connected because you have the
Right.
modeled,
If
like
you're
whatever
using
model
historic
is.
data, then you wouldn't need a connection. But if you're using real-time data, like if the machine is learning and improving in real time based on
Yeah,
new sensory information, then you would
yeah,
need
yeah,
connectivity.
definitely. And most of them, to your point, most of the devices will be learning actively all the time. Like it doesn't really make sense to not be learning if there is potentially new information coming in and if you
Right.
have the capacity to do that.
Like
So,
gaming is a perfect example because as you're going through these virtual worlds, it's updating in real time and it's changing and
mhm.
you know. But anyway, so I mean, how I've been thinking about 5G has been sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly of 5G. So I feel like we've touched a lot of what is good about it. Now
Mhm.
I think we should get into what's bad about it and then finally what's ugly. And then we can get
Okay.
into the future scenarios. So
Okay.
what in your mind is bad about 5G?
So the most obvious is the health concerns.
Hmm.
And, there are definitely others, but I want to touch on the health concerns first. So we spoke at the beginning about how 5G has this shorter wavelength
Yeah.
frequency. So basically, what that means from a living organism perspective is that it actually touches and can disrupt our bodies at an atomic
Hmm.
level. So these and if you mess up our body and our communication and our cells from an atomic level, then you can start affecting DNA and, let's say, other things, and you can start causing these mutations.
Right.
And this can lead to a higher cancer incidence, where basically anyone who's always near these 5G networks has a higher likelihood of getting cancer, because there's so many of these short wavelengths penetrating the body, and or not fully penetrating the body, because with let's say microwave radiation, that can just pass right through without really affecting
Hmm.
the cells or the atoms. But with these shorter wavelengths, a lot of bad things can happen, especially since there has to be so many receivers, because they can't pass through anything that's solid, really.
Yeah.
Um, and that can, even besides cancer, this could probably lead to birth defects and other sort of mutations, or, it can alter the gene expression of living people to give them, let's say, a higher likelihood for something else that's highly dependent on your gene expression.
Right.
I'm just really worried about the health benefit, or the health effects.
Yeah, I mean, they've done research studies, and in one study, they found that when rats were exposed to cell radiation, they had a higher incidence of tumor growth. And other industry people have fought back against that and said that, well, what happens in animals isn't always directly correlated to what happens in humans. And the level of radiation isn't actually that high. So our standards actually, it's still within our standards. I mean, this is what proponents of 5G will tell you. But
Yeah.
one thing that I noticed in doing research is that all of the research studies have been with existing levels of radiation, meaning 4G or less. None of
Hmm.
the studies have had the level of radiation that would be in an environment with 5G, where you have a cell tower every 10 to 12 houses, which is what we would need. And there certainly has not been a study of that amount of exposure over your whole life, like from the time
Yeah.
you're conceived to the, being born, your childhood, your adulthood. Obviously, nothing, no study like that has happened. So it really is an unknown. And all of the scientists that I've heard, they pretty much all come to the same conclusion, which is that we need to wait. We need to do more research. We need to see what actually, what was going to result from this.
Hmm.
And of course, no one is willing to wait, because there's this global race going on, and it's a
Yeah.
political thing, and it's a technological thing, and it's a business thing. But
Yeah.
these are
It's
very real concerns. And like I called up to our listeners, I called up Justin because I had this idea for a business where I was like, oh my God, everyone's going to be needing to have protection for their house. I mean,
mhm.
like if I think of myself as a young parent, you're going to want to put some sort of radiation blocking wallpaper or paint or panels or something in your house
Yeah.
at least to have one room inside your house that is radiation free, like maybe your child's bedroom and like your master bedroom. The rest of it can be connected, but it's going to be crucial to have some safe spaces, I
Yeah.
believe.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see how people react to these sorts of innovations. So we see these kinds of potentially dangerous innovations in the food space, like
Hmm.
Roundup and glyphosate being added to our food infrastructure and our food production. Um, People still they're trying to say that there's no effect to people in the end, because there's such a long lag time, like you were
Mm.
saying, between when you get infected, or whenever you're exposed to this thing, whether that's Roundup or whether that's
Yeah.
5G
I mean,
radiation.
these are things that the Environmental Protection Agency should be looking into, but
Yeah, it
instead
just
we
depends on
have
who's in
basically,
charge of the EPA,
yeah,
or who's in
exactly.
charge of the government, or who is paying the most money to pass certain laws,
Right.
like the lobbyists, which is really
It's a
concerning.
huge failure of our system.
Hmm. Maybe we should talk too about, now we know that there are definitely health risks. There have been studies about it. What about the security risks? Because right
Yeah.
now we should talk about Huawei.
Right,
the Chinese
right.
company, and what they're doing to, you know, penetrate the entire global market with
Yeah.
5G technology.
Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, the reason why 5G is such a big security concern is because, like we said, it's a software-based telecommunication system, and any type of software is vulnerable to backdoors, right? Because
Hmm.
think about like when you go to sleep and your phone is charging and you have a new software update the next day, just like how we saw that recent hack where when you called someone and they didn't pick up, you could still see through their camera and you could still hear them. This was a
Hmm.
recent,
Yeah,
iPhone,
the Apple. Yeah.
this Apple bug. Just like how that is a bug that came through an update from iPhone's software system, there can be
Hmm.
software bugs or maybe intentional
Yeah, that would
backdoors.
be that would
Yeah.
be what I'd say
So like
probably
anyone who says
warranted.
like, "Oh no, like we can double check and triple check and make sure that there's no backdoor," it just doesn't understand how easy it is if you truly are intimately familiar with the technology to create
Yeah,
workarounds. Because basically it's
yeah,
like whoever knows the most about the technology, which is always the person that built it, is
yeah.
going to be the one who knows how to exploit it.
Hmm.
And so, just from a technological side, that's why 5G is a concern. And then, from like specifically around Huawei, so they are the second biggest cell phone manufacturer and telecommunications company in the world. They're bigger than Apple. So it goes Samsung, Huawei, Apple. And they're getting bigger every single day.
Yeah,
And
that's terrifying.
it's kind of like it's just kind of the latest in the trend of Apple creating or sorry, of China creating a knockoff of everything. Like they
Yeah.
created a knockoff of Google with, their web search system. They created a
Hmm.
knockoff of Facebook with like
Yeah.
Weibo. They created like
They
a
basically create knockoffs of everything,
yeah, yeah. So this is like their knockoff cell, manufacturer. And
like our Qualcomm, basically.
yeah. And look, Huawei was started by a guy who was, Communist Party
Hmm.
member, and like there's no distinction between the private sector and the public sector there. It's all very
Yeah.
very much the same entity.
And the whole, at least the vibe that I get from everything I read is China is looking to dominate the information space.
Yes, information
And
domination is their motto.
yeah, so the issue too with backdoors and allowing Huawei into the U.S. because there are arguments that look, we should allow them to compete in the U.S. market if we're allowed to see their devices.
Right, right.
But the counter to that, I think, is if we do let them into the market, they, like you were saying, a lot of these backdoors can be created through software. And if they selectively decide which software to present to the US, then
Right.
we're never going to find anything because there's nothing there. Even if we have, which we do, we have some super genius white hat hackers, the ones that can, find these vulnerabilities, even black hat or gray hat hackers, the bad and like
Yeah.
sort of bad, sort of good hackers
Well,
that
anytime
can,
there's a software update, you'd have to reevaluate the system.
yeah,
And once you already have the infrastructure in place, it's really difficult to just like, oh, we found a vulnerability. We're going to strip out all of this infrastructure that we spent billions of dollars putting in place, and all of our security system and utilities are tied up to this infrastructure.
yeah,
So the reason this is so big right now is because right now is when all of the countries are installing 5G. And what company they decide to go with to install that infrastructure is going to have far-reaching implications for the next several decades.
hmm
So I think it'd be good to see how different countries are responding to this. So, for instance, the Czech Republic had their 3G and 4G infrastructure installed by Huawei.
hmm
So they will likely do 5G also with Huawei, although the US is lobbying against that.
yeah,
Poland is interesting because they're a NATO ally and Huawei had strategically made deals with them so that they can basically have all of their infrastructure in
Yep.
Poland, and therefore what the US thinks is a backdoor into the whole NATO communications. Um,
Oh, yeah, because if one country is compromised and everyone is communicating with that country, then all the information is still intercepted, and
right.
then it can be sent back to Huawei or, Beijing, depending on what the connections are. I hope it would be nice if Huawei was more benevolent, but I find it
Yeah.
hard to believe that even though there hasn't been like explicit allegations or
Well,
accusations about that.
there's been some evidence, like for instance with South Korea, I was reading that we had noticed, American cybersecurity experts had noticed that information being sent from Canada to South Korea was being
Hmm.
diverted to China. And South
Oh man.
Korea is entirely dependent on Huawei infrastructure. And so, what the cybersecurity experts think is that this was basically a test to see if China could effectively intercept all of the information in this one channel where they have infrastructure control. And so
Oh.
there's been lots of circumstantial evidence around what China's trying to do.
Hmm.
And China's just not the kind of country that operates randomly. Everything they do is well
Yeah.
planned out, and they can plan
Hmm.
ahead for the next 100 years, whereas
Yeah, they're not worried
Americans,
about election cycles.
exactly,
They're just
yeah,
they
um,
can continue the dynasty of, whatever it is and pass it down through generations, which is, it's interesting to see how it's done, but I just think it's done in the entirely wrong way. Like it's done in a way so they can control people, so they
right,
can,
right,
limit what they see and have, concentrate power more effectively
yeah.
into like
Well,
the
that's the thing. Like, if China was a freedom of information, freedom of thought, freedom of belief sort of country,
Mhm.
then there wouldn't be any issue, really.
Mhm.
If the next biggest producer of telecommunications infrastructure was the Netherlands or Denmark, there'd be no issue. It's the fact that China continuously censors information. Like if you're in China, you cannot search for Tiananmen Square and get an actual result.
Yeah.
Just like you can't show a photo of Winnie the Pooh because he looks like President Xi. I mean, there are some pretty whack rules in China
Wow.
where you,
I've never heard that one.
yeah, yeah,
The Winnie the
yeah.
Pooh.
Because
Wow.
people made fun of President Xi as looking like Winnie the Pooh from this one picture he had with Obama. And so they just straight up banned Winnie the Pooh. And it's like, okay, if this country is going to ban Winnie the Pooh, what else are they going to ban? And what kind of world does that look like if you're a kid and you grow up and you cannot accurately research history or popular
Yeah.
culture? I mean, this is, I think, even more dire than most people realize because, I mean, we'll get into the future scenarios, but we could see the internet basically fork off into two different paths. One that's free flowing Western information version of the internet, and
Mhm.
one that's a one stop shop for authoritarians where you can
Yeah.
censor people, you can surveil them, you can put misinformation in there or propaganda,
Mhm.
and just limit the flow of information however you so desire.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we this is probably a good time to start talking about the worst case, best case, and most
Yeah.
likely.
All right, well, let's take a quick break and then let's get into the worst case for the future of 5G. All right, so Justin, what do you think is the worst case scenario for the future of 5G?
Worst case scenario.
Yeah, so I kind of went in a couple of different ways. So we were just talking about the security risks, but the first thing that I'm concerned about is the health
Hmm.
of everybody. And the issue that we talked about is 5G is going to be rolled out in the big cities first, which has the highest concentration of people. And I see an issue with that because people are going to, there's going to be a huge chunk of the population that are exposed to this potentially dangerous wave or these potentially dangerous wavelengths. And if we start seeing these big, let's say, birth defects or cancer rates, if we see all of these things spiking, then, that's obviously a terrible scenario. And then worse is if people like lobbyists or anyone else who's really, a proponent of 5G, whether that's because it makes them more money or something else, similar to what we've seen as a fundamental issue in the politics of the US, then, it's going to be around and no one's going to do anything. There's going to be a small majority of people that are saying bad stuff is happening. It's causing cancer. It's causing birth defects. But since there's so much of a lag time, people can make the argument that, well, there's not enough evidence. You can't assume causation when there's just correlation. If there's no direct effect, then, we're fine. Let's just keep going forward. So that's one worst case, is like the health effects. And I think the health effects will probably be even worse than we think when put in dense urban environments, because in dense environments, when there's big buildings, then they need to be all over the place, like more frequently than every like 10 houses, whatever number we saw earlier, 2 to 8. There's a big range. But anyways, yeah, that's one of the worst cases.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, when you look at what's the worst thing that could happen as humans, obviously the end of humanity is one of the worst things that could happen. The end of all life would be worse.
Yeah.
But if this somehow leads to mass infertility or, weird kinds of mutations, that could be really bad. Especially, I really worry about the young people and babies and toddlers and adolescents, because a lot of the research has shown that younger people are much more susceptible because you're still developing. And another interesting thing I learned in my research is that your skin actually plays a big role in deflecting wavelengths and frequencies that are not advantageous. So your skin is like one of your best defense mechanisms. And this is getting a little mystical, but a lot of mystics and spiritual people also believe that the frequency at which your atoms vibrate, like, your vibes, also play a role in your defense mechanism. So if you feel very confident with yourself, you're very at peace with yourself, you are not in a bad place mentally, physically, spiritually, if you're overall healthy, or as one way I've heard it described, if the master is home, then it's much less likely that an outside intruder will be able to get in the form of a mutation or whatnot. So especially if you're like a troubled teenager, for instance, or like a baby that doesn't like really know what's going on, that's like yet another reason why you could be more susceptible to these wavelengths. So,
oh wow,
yeah. So the health implications are real, and that's part of my worst case. As far as national security, because I included this also in my worst case, I have really two scenarios, and one of them comes from the other. So I imagine a world where half of the world is basically like China, meaning half of the world is living in another version of reality without all of the information of what has actually happened historically and what's actually going on. So if you think about, like, if China creates this version of the internet that is, basically a plug and play authoritarian regime, you can like make a list of all the words you don't want your citizens to know about, and you can make a list of all of the, bits of information you want to shove down their throats. And you want to censor anyone and like flag whoever could be a potential dissident or political rival, and then immediately, like, using AI, ban them from air travel outside the country, or like silence them on social media. Like, if you have this type of system in place, and then China gives it to North Korea, and then China gives it to Russia, and then other developing countries that really just want the best possible price, like lots of Africa and Asia, and then other parts of Eastern Europe that are kind of on the periphery, like Czech Republic, Poland, Ukraine.
Yeah.
very soon you could see a situation where half of the world is in a completely different version of reality, just has completely different facts that they're working off of. They could think that America like truly is the devil just by having the wrong, facts in
Yeah.
place. And then
I,
just going into the actual worst case scenario would be if then there is like a confrontation between East and West around this freedom of thought, China and the East may win out simply because they have way more information at their disposal.
yeah.
And if that happens, then the whole world could become a dystopia where no one knows the actual facts. Everyone's looking at a censored version of the internet.
Man, yeah, that's truly terrifying to think about. What do you think for the best case to lighten up a little
Yeah.
bit?
Best case scenario.
So I had a lot of trouble with the best case scenario because it's really hard to see a situation where the US and China stop being at loggerheads, like stop being rivals.
Yeah.
On the one hand, we are very dependent on China, and China's very dependent on us. I mean, since World War II, both of our economies have directly gone up, largely
Hmm.
because we've done such a good job of taking the best of both countries.
Yeah.
So, my best case scenario is a situation in which we collaborate with China. We do not create two versions of the internet. Instead, we find a way to, you know, have both versions. And I actually think what the UK did is interesting in this regard, where the UK has a lot of Huawei infrastructure, but then they hired national security and cybersecurity experts to go in and find any problematic parts of that infrastructure, pull it out, and then put in their own replacements. And so that I thought that was an interesting kind of like hybrid option where it's
Yeah.
like you're still taking advantage of the cost benefits, but you're making sure it's secure for yourself. And I don't know if that's actually a good solution, but I guess my best case scenario is some way for us to collaborate with China so that we all still have the same internet and we can still trust sending information to their servers and vice versa. And we're not like making countries go one way or the other. And somehow,
Yeah.
maybe it's like we set up some sort of international council that also uses AI that is able to like measure any sort of backdoors. And it's really tricky,
Yeah.
man. I had a lot of trouble with the best case.
Yeah. Best case is the US wins the AI war and then and then we can, dominate
Yeah.
everything. Or some sort of
It's just
some
hard
form of
to
open AI.
envision that. I mean, I guess like if OpenAI won or if Google won out and yeah, I
Yeah.
guess that really is the best case. If
At least from the security perspective of
yeah.
this. Yeah, I think you covered the security part of the best case really well. So I'll talk on my best case for the health benefits. Um, so one thing that I was interested in seeing is, so this is kind of a three-stepped thing for me also. So for the first one, either the best case is there really is no health side effects of 5G, right? So it's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah.
Everyone can use it. There's nothing wrong with it. I think that's unlikely, but or another part of the best case would be something like a radiation vaccine where you can basically
Yes.
inoculate yourself from being, from having issues related to radiation. So you can make sure that they have the defenses to handle certain types of radiation, which I looked up. I don't know much about all the terminology that was used, but I looked up and there are definitely people studying this area.
Oh
So there are
yeah.
also like cancer vaccines, radiation vaccines,
I mean, we're
which would
we're
be really
pretty close to
interesting.
solving cancer from what I know. And
Hmm.
one of the main methods is using your own T cells to fight cancer. So basically, it's like, let's take out all of your good cells that fight against the intruders. let's make some changes to them to make them even more effective, and then let's inject it right into the areas where it's needed.
Mm.
Obviously, if there's like a less messy way, like in the movie Elysium, where he just has that, like basically like an like a steamer for shirts that like just heals your whole body, like that would be nicer. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
if we solve cancer, then that would be a big step forward in combating
Yeah.
5G and connectivity and all that.
As long, as long as afterwards we can also defend ourselves from the other effects. We can defend ourselves from giving birth to children with defects, genetic defects or cellular defects, something along those lines. So yeah, there are things that I think can happen. We just need to make sure that we're at least protected on the health front. But then, so I think that's step number one. We need to figure out the health thing. Step number two, and these all assume that we're in the US version of 5G where it's pretty safe and we trust everyone. Um, so anyways, the second part is we kind of usher in an era of smart cities where we can truly um, or we can truly have the capacity for automation and AI
Mm.
to learn and to basically just automate everything that we've talked about in the past, in the previous episodes, the future of intelligence, the future of automation. All of these things can actually happen when we have these highly connected cities
Yeah.
where devices can be learning. So if we have like a central AI, but its nervous system and its limbic system is all of these sensors all over the place, right?
Yeah.
It needs this internet infrastructure to do that, and we need we'll need that sort of that internet device, or
Yeah.
those
Well,
internet connected devices.
Well, I always go back to the Earthling perspective, which is that
Mm-hmm.
first and foremost, we're all Earthlings. We're all trying to do what's best for Earth, even if you
Mm-hmm.
don't realize it. And we're basically upgrading our own capability to do what's best for Mother Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And if we do that successfully, just like how we're speeding up time relative to the speed at which plants move, it's like our ability to respond to, let's say, like a meteor coming and threatening us, or global climate change and needing to tweak the climate system a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
or like foreseeing other threats coming at us, will be
Yeah,
much, much greater with 5G, so long as the various nodes of Mother Earth don't kill each other. Like
yeah,
China and the US, we're essentially all on the same mission. It's just that we have a different philosophy, and so which philosophy wins out obviously has huge implications to us as humans, but from an earthling perspective, it may not matter that
yeah.
much.
If eventually we transcend this, this human form that we're in,
Exactly.
and we become some sort of cyborg humans, or, the far future humans are some sort of cyborg.
Well, just whenever there's super intelligence, whenever machines are smarter than any
Yeah.
possible human, that's going to come fairly soon, and 5G is going to allow us to basically communicate with machines in real time,
Mm.
hopefully on behalf of Mother Earth and what's best for other Earthlings.
Yeah, and that actually leads to my third step of this best case, and that is if we are highly connected and we're living these highly connected lives, we at least have the infrastructure to allow AI to learn. Let's say AI gets to the next level, the super intelligence level,
Hmm.
and we also have a company like Neuralink, some sort of brain machine interface, but we with this highly connected device, like this probably transcends 5G and moves on to something, totally different. I don't even know what it would look like. But basically, everyone is part of this collective consciousness. Like if I'm trying to think about something, I can tap into the thoughts of everybody else. I'm still
Mm.
living in the present in my own body, but I can actually, as I'm thinking and looking at my memories through everybody else's thoughts and memories.
Mm.
So it's like I have the experience of everybody else without having personally lived my own experience of, all of this stuff.
Wow, I
But
love that.
we need this highly connected, this super fast internet that's almost instantaneous throughout the world for this to be a thing. It's almost like transcending the human brain and making the human brain, like each individual human brain, a single neuron of this like
Right.
far future brain. So that's kind of like the super far out, like
Yeah,
century or
I
two
like
down
that.
the line.
Yeah. All right, let's get into the most likely scenario.
Most likely scenario.
So I,
Okay,
I guess I can
yeah,
start
you go
this
ahead.
one. So my most likely scenario from a national security perspective is that there's going to be a growing number of modern authoritarian states.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's fairly unavoidable, at least in the short term. Meaning, just like how we see, Iran and Turkey and Venezuela and certain countries that have authoritarian regimes, a lot of these regimes have had a tough time because their people have free access to information and they can rebel and organize against the dictator. I think what we're going to see in the near term in the future are more authoritarian states that have the ability to censor information, to surveil their citizens, and to control the narrative. Now, I don't know at what point this is going to come to a head. I don't think the most likely scenario is that all countries end up being authoritarian. That's the worst
Yeah.
case. But I do think that there is going to be a battle for freedom of information. And I could see situations where there's sort of an underbelly of companies and products and tools and maybe CIA operations or whatever that basically try to give information access to people who don't have information access.
Mm-hmm.
And I think through that, a lot of these regimes may fall apart because I strongly believe that in the end, truth always prevails.
Mm-hmm.
And you can only fool people for so long. And yeah, we might have a couple terrible like decades or whatever if you're living
Right.
in one of these authoritarian countries. But I truly believe that the most likely scenario is that in the end, freedom of information prevails. And like you said, we become sort of this global network of nodes that can all cooperate to do what's best for the planet and for all of our fellow beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. So, so my likely scenario that, I think you touched on the security risks pretty well, but I think in the short term we're going to have, some cities adopting 5G, some cities don't adopt 5G. But what I'm worried about is the countries and the places that are desperate to position themselves as a some sort of innovation leader. So you have some countries, let's say in East Europe, that are trying to do what they can to attract entrepreneurship and innovation.
Hmm.
So I think what they're going to do is take the cheapest, fastest, short-term solution and go with Huawei,
Right.
even if they don't necessarily know what the side effects are. And then that could lead to health consequences. And then I don't think the health consequences are going to show up until decades after it's
Hmm.
introduced. Like I don't think we'll see any sort of significant, like statistically significant results for, the next couple decades.
Hmm.
And then people are going to very clearly, the same way that all of these dangerous technologies continue to thrive in the US, um, are, I think it's going to be the same way with 5G, which
Yeah.
is sort of unfortunate. Um,
Well, it has been interesting that cancer rates have been going down in the last several years as more
is
tech.
that true?
That's what I've in my
Huh,
research I found.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at like the timeline of cancer rates, but
Oh, maybe it's more
just
that the
intuitively.
death rate's down 25% since 1991. So maybe we're just
Okay.
better getting better at treating it.
Yeah, keeping people alive.
But there could be other implications, like we could see more. autism. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
really hard to predict like what implications there could be as far as health, but
Yeah, and I think the fact that no one, I think there will be a select few researchers that are like, this is really bad, we need to stop. But I don't think they'll have a loud enough voice to actually, make any sort of policy changes because we're going to have companies like Qualcomm or, if we're just discounting Huawei altogether being in the US, then I think there's going to be I don't think it's going to go away. Like there
yeah.
will be 5G. There's no going back at this point because it is a race to it's a race of information. It's a race to see which company or which country will dominate the internet.
Yeah,
Um,
dominate information.
and I think the side effect of that will be the health consequences. I don't even think our um, then I have, the whole philosophy of like, why do individuals need more technology? I mean, I do think that what I talked about in the best case scenario would definitely be the best case scenario, which requires more technology. But we also need to ask ourselves, like, why do we need people to have better mobile internet? Um,
Right.
like, is that something that we want? Do we want more people to be immersed into their augmented reality
It's because
worlds?
people are never satisfied with what they have.
Yeah,
It's a trait of human nature. It's not like we actually need better internet and more GDP, and we don't need any of that. Just sit in a nice, beautiful mountain cabin and look at the birds and the fishes. And
yeah,
I agree, it's not like we need this, but it's a fact that it's coming, and it's good to be informed about these trends. And so if you're a businessman and you're thinking of businesses, I would definitely listen to the types of businesses that we've identified that you can, will now be possible with 5G, like remote surgery, VR, autonomous vehicles, machine learning, brain-machine interfaces, any sort of Internet of Things device,
yeah.
all of
I
that.
still think sensors is going to be huge because right now sensors are decent, but they're not great.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so if you're a computer engineer and you're good with like embedded systems, like sensors and these little devices all over the cities that we're living in are going to be ubiquitous. Like
hmm,
we're going to have sensors everywhere. And if you can start a company that makes good sensors, even if
yeah,
it's something obscure like tracking, I don't know, the mycelial network underneath the ground. I don't really know what that would look like, but there are so many things that you can do with the sensors that I think would be beneficial to humanity. Just if
yeah.
you can manage what you measure. For is that Peter Drucker, his famous
Right,
saying,
right.
"What gets measured gets managed."
Yeah.
So the better sensors we have, we can actually manage these different systems and learn about these systems in a more complete way.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I guess some final thoughts I have. I wouldn't recommend getting a 5G phone until 2020. Just
Mm.
one piece of advice, because the current 5G phones aren't really 5G. They're sort of like a narrow version of 5G where it will only work in certain areas, and a lot of technologists have said that once the full-fledged version of 5G comes out, those early 5G phones may not work on the full network.
Mm.
So, as a consumer, I would say wait till 2020. As a business owner, I would say look at the opportunities. As a parent, I would say look into,
Protecting
Faraday
your home.
caging your home, or at least one room in your home.
Yeah.
And as a diplomat, I would say let's try to build one version of the internet that's safe for everyone and have free flowing information.
We are all
I think
gathered
that's a
here
good place to
today to
wrap
talk
up.
about three
Yeah.
very important things.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening.
We're going
This
to talk
has been
about
the
what
future
has
of
happened,
5G.
what is currently
Hope you tune in
happening,
next
and what
time.
will inevitably happen.
The past, the present, and the future.
Our computer is picking up a strange signal.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
What's the world coming to?
The past, the present, and the future.